Hello and welcome everyone to this Iowa Organic Association webinar. We are excited to have with us today Karl Palmberg from Sunlight and Rain Farm. I actually found Karl through a podcast, so if you like to listen to podcasts, I would encourage you to go check out Roots and Ruminants podcast. I believe is where I heard you from episode back in the fall. Karl, does that sound right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
Those I've purchased cover crop seed from them, and those folks have a webinar or a podcast.
Perfect. Podcast. Yep. Well, that's
Hmm.
awesome. We are excited to have Karl with us. As I mentioned, if you have noticed already, there is a option for a poll. Just trying to see how many people are watching with you. If you do have questions, the chat may or may not be open. I think it should be open, but you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Um, and also, if you want to let us know where you're watching from, that would be great as well. My name, as I mentioned, is Ethan. I am the Iowa Organic Association TOP, which is a transition to organic partnership program education and outreach mentor. So that means I travel the state talking with college classes, students about the opportunities in organic and really focusing also on supporting farmers through training like webinars such as this, on-farm field days, just opportunities connecting organic farmers with other organic farmers for education. The other thing that I am really excited about is this Transition to Organic Partnership Program, which is a USDA program that helps beginning farmers or farmers wanting to transition to organic make that switch with a mentorship pair. So if you are interested in organic agriculture, transitioning some acres to organic agriculture, there are a lot of opportunities out there right now. And one of those opportunities is a mentorship. So we do want to work with you if you are interested in that, and you can get in touch with us through the emails that you received about this webinar. Just a little bit more about the Iowa Organic Association. We are a statewide nonprofit committed to organic education, advocacy, and cooperation. And our membership is a diverse community of Iowa's organic farmers. So we have gardeners, food and farm businesses, organizations, advocates, and consumers who are devoted to building a more sustainable Iowa. In doing that, as I mentioned, we offer a lot of field days, technical assistance programs, webinars, and just connection opportunities for Iowa's organic farmers. Today, we have Karl from Sunlight and Rain, right? The two things that you
Yes, that's right.
Sunlight and Rain, the two things, the basics of um, grazing cattle. And so I'm going to bring him on here in a second. Just as a reminder, we do have 5 more webinars coming up. The next one is this following week. We'll be talking about weed management for row crops with Scott Shriver from Shriver Farm. We'll have direct marketing with Carly Zerke from Northeast Iowa, robotic milking in February, and then finish up in March with soil health and organic apple and cider production. So be checking your inbox for details on more of that. But now I just want to hand it over to Karl. And if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the chat. I'll kind of pass that along to Karl. And also, also, if you can raise your hand if you want to ask any questions as well. So go ahead, Karl.
Okay, thanks, Ethan. Feel free to jump in anytime. My name is Karl Palmberg. I farm in the northwest tip of Iowa. Right across the road is South Dakota. And so I farm here with my wife, and we've got 6 small kids and family farm operation. You notice you don't hear kids in the background. I'm over at my mom's place right now to make sure that it's quiet while we do this webinar. So uh, just a kind of a 30-second history of how we got to where we are. The farm that I grew up on, family farm since 1938 or so, a lot of heavy tillage in the past. I went off to the military for a while and then came back to the farm. And when I did, I kind of had a renewed desire to understand how things work from a very basic level. And so I wanted to learn how plants function, how animals function, how people function, and things like that. And so with that, I knew that we needed to start decreasing tillage in order to increase organic matter. I really didn't know what organic matter was actually at that time. And I didn't know why decreasing tillage would have a positive impact, but I was confident that I needed to do it because everybody said that. So we started to do some no-till with our soybeans and strip tilling with our corn. So you see the strip till machine that I built there, fashioned together an old International planter with some strip till units and threw a Montag dry fertilizer cart on the top and tried to pull that with my 4640 and did some strip tilling for a little while. Got pulled back into full-time military service. I was with the Air National Guard. And when I did that, just as a survival mechanism, I planted all of our row crop ground. We got about 400 or 500 acres of row crop ground, a couple hundred acres of pasture, planted all of our row crop ground to alfalfa. And so that I could pay somebody to hay it, and I didn't have to plant in the spring, combine in the fall. So that's how everything got into alfalfa. And then I continued to kind of pursue my understanding of agriculture as well as human health. And so got started down the train of kind of learning about the detriments of seed oils, omega-6 fatty acids, and some of the information that the Weston A. Price Foundation puts out. And so that kind of steered me or herded me, pun intended, I guess, towards the grass-fed beef. And so now we, with our growing cattle herd, we're concentrating on raising grass-fed beef. So the goal on our farm is to reflect God's glory of his creation and then raise food that's healthy enough to be considered medicine. So both of those things, I think, we as farmers, I think, need to acknowledge the beauty of creation. And then I think we cannot shirk the responsibility to be producers of good food that ends in good quality people as well, and healthy people. Slide, Ethan.
Awesome. And just as a heads up to everybody, I do have the chat enabled now, so everybody can use it.
Cool. All right. So I gave Ethan a number of topics that we could cover that I knew something about anyway. And these are the ones that he chose. So first of all, like I said, we planted everything to alfalfa. And so I've learned quite a bit of alfalfa over the past few years. Some of the positives and negatives as we've tried to work with that while we're not certified organic, we pretty much hold to the organic standards. I'm not spraying anymore. I'm not doing anything that wouldn't be considered organic. And then I also wanted to decrease or eliminate tillage. So trying to work with the alfalfa doing that. Some of the positives of alfalfa, it's very competitive. So cutting it every 23 to 28 days, baling and wrapping it is what we did. And that really eradicates the Canadian thistle. So that was one of the greatest things for one of the most difficult weeds on our farm. And we applied some compost the first couple years to the alfalfa. And the guy that is doing the alfalfa for us, he planted a non-GMO alfalfa for us, and then Harv Extra and a bunch of other traded alfalfas around the area. He kind of gave his seed dealer a hard time about why is this cheap non-GMO alfalfa out yielding a lot of our really expensive seed. So we've had a good history with producing alfalfa in that system. Now that we're trying to transition out of that, back into, my goal is to go towards forage cropping. So raising crops that could be used for forage, either grazing or haying and storing and feeding later, with kind of a perennial understory of alfalfa or some legume, kind of Elaine Ingham style. And so you can see that picture there on the bottom left, the strips in the alfalfa. I tried a whole bunch of different no-till organic options to try to raise corn in an alfalfa field to be able to get the weed suppression and the nitrogen from the alfalfa. The alfalfa was so competitive. I really struggled with that. Those strips there are the result of me taking a backpack sprayer and spraying out every different type of organic herbicide that I could find. Green gobbler and a bunch of other basically burners that had Some of them had cinnamon oil. It smelled like somebody's chewing big red gum. And they singed the crop like you see, but it barely set it back. And it came up, and then I tried, before I built an inter-row mower, I just went out there with a push mower, you see in that next picture, and mowed up and down the strips. And I got to where I could raise like 75 bushel corn with the alfalfa under there, with a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of risk. The possibility of having no corn was there as well. So I've struggled with that. I know Rick Clark and some other folks are making more progress in that, and I'm seeing more folks do that with a roller crimper, and we're pursuing some of that still as well. Some of the negatives with the having all that alfalfa is I haven't seen the increase in soil aggregation and soil structure that I wanted to see with a kind of a long-term no-till system with the alfalfa. And whether that is because of a whole bunch of nitrogen from the alfalfa, or whether that's just because of that one type of root in the soil, that's the tap root. It's not a very fibrous root like winter rye or something like that. And there's also heavy traffic. We take 5 cuttings of the alfalfa with heavy equipment out there. And so I'm looking forward to having something else growing with the alfalfa in the future to try to increase the soil aggregation out there. Harvest equipment and expense. So I have somebody custom harvest it, and they do ultra high density square baling and then wrap those in plastic, which is very effective, produces wonderful feed, but it's pretty expensive. It's anywhere from $60 to $100 a bale in harvest cost. And then finally, the alfalfa is very competitive and hard to kill. I've tried to do a little bit with some ripping tillage, a little bit less than full plowing. You really have to go at the alfalfa is very resilient, and it bounces back quite a bit. So, yeah, go ahead.
Are you using any of this alfalfa, or is it part of a rotation, or is this just a cash crop?
Good question. Yeah, so it's predominantly cash crop. Last year, I basically kept some of my square bales. I get half, the harvester gets half. I kept some of my square bales to feed to my grass finishers, because it was the highest sugar content feed that I had available on my farm. I tried harvesting a few different grasses and baling and wrapping them, and trying to do that when they were still very vegetative to try to get the highest sugar content I could. And so I fed some of that, but the rest of it went to dairies. And now, as we'll kind of get into, I'm transitioning more of the pure alfalfa stand over towards dedicated forage crop for my animals. Last year, I harvested winter rye and alfalfa together. So the previous fall, I spiked in winter rye into the alfalfa after the 5th cutting, and the winter rye grew up in the fall, and then in the spring with the alfalfa, and it was pretty competitive, as winter rye is, and alfalfa was 2 big guns dueling it out. And I harvested both of them together. So we cut it all, baled it, and wrapped it together. So the baleage had alfalfa and winter rye in it. And that ended up being what I'm feeding out this year for my finishers that I'm just starting to slaughter now.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So rotationally grazing. So we've got cow-calf. And right now we've got about 80 mama cows. We're kind of in a growing phase. We went from basically 20, and we'll see where we end up. So we're growing. We're doing rotational grazing with our cow-calf herd for a while, and now I'm doing rotational grazing with my finishers as well. So we'll get to the management of those finishers here in a little bit, but just the logistics of rotational grazing, I was going to go over that here. So some of the techniques and the equipment. A lot of people talk about the fencing, but I think the water is the more challenging part. And so central tank versus poly water line and movable tanks is kind of what we've done. Uh, I have done a little bit of a water wagon that I haul out there with the tank and move that as well. But mostly in our perennial pastures, I have some cross fencing within the pastures that's high tensile steel. And then within those cross fenced paddocks, I can run a temporary wire. And from the main hydrant, from the well in the pasture or from rural water hydrants, I have a 1 inch black poly line that runs underneath some of the fences and kind of goes around in a skeleton formation to cover most of my paddocks, to where I can plug into that with a garden hose and run it to a black poly tank. The line comes in 300-foot sections, and so usually my splice to splice those two lines together, I have a T that is two hose T's, as well as I think it's about a 3/4 inch threaded third leg, and then I screw in a copper valve that they make for like the bottom of water heaters, and you can put a hose onto that. It was like the cheapest pipe thread to hose valve that I could find. And so about every 300 feet on that line, I've got a possibility for putting a water in. So I can move the water tanks around as much as I desire. And then also the other option is kind of some of the more permanent waters. So we put in a couple or a few of these waters that are pictured on your screen there. As far as a frost-free, energy-free water, this thermosync, I think is what it's called, I've been pretty happy with. It's got 3 cylinders that are insulated and go like 7 feet into the ground. And at the bottom, they are not insulated, therefore getting some of the ground heat. And then each of those 3 cylinders is connected to each other. The center one is where the pipe comes up from the bottom with a float. You can just barely see the float in that right picture there. And so it operates a float. When the cattle drink off of the sides, the water level goes down, the float operates and then flows to the side ones there. You put that green cap on most of the time. The more cattle that are drinking off of it, the better for winter time as far as freezing. No surprise there. And then I also have been experimenting this year with doing a little bit more apple cider vinegar application for my cattle. And that center tube is a little bit handy for that. I just pop the lid off, pour some apple cider vinegar in the center silo, and then it's able to kind of meter out apple cider vinegar all day long to the cattle as they drink. So the first ones don't get all of it and the last ones don't get none of it. So that's the water. Fencers and energizers. A lot of folks run the solar fencers. We did that a little bit. I prefer to have a plug-in fencer. They're just so much more powerful, and you don't have to worry about solar and battery and things like that. For those, good grounding is the key. You want to have more grounding than what they recommend, like buy a dozen, posts, and possibly even run a ground wire along your fence, like a hot wire and a ground wire. So if they touch both of them, they get shocked. I've got 2 different styles of fencer energizers. The one that I found to be the most bang for the buck, I think, is the Gallagher. It's a 10 joule fencer. I don't know, Gallagher 1000 or something like that. And that was the largest fencer from Gallagher that I could get that didn't have a bunch of bells and whistles like multi-zones and all that type of stuff, just a straight fencer. And that's been a pretty good workhorse for us on a couple different locations. I also purchased like the biggest fencer you can possibly buy, a Speedrite like 63 joule fencer. And that one had some problems. Now they're sending me a new one. When it was working, it was really nice because then I could run a lot more fence than I could on these 10 joule fencers. And it also has, if you're going to get any bells and whistles on a fence energizer, get an energizer that you can shut off from in the field. And those have a deal where from the fault finder, tool and voltage tester, you can put it on the fence and actually shut the fencer off remotely from out in the field. So you can shut it off, work on it, and then turn it back on again, which is a huge benefit. That would be one of the big benefits to having something, with Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or something like that as well. So that's the Energizer. Moves, more versus few. So obviously the more you move them, the more you work, and the more they work for you in the field. I've kind of gotten to be where when the grass is growing fast, I try to move them more often. And when it's growing more slowly, I don't move them as often. So I move them. I've moved them twice a day, a couple times, but mostly it's single day moves as much as I can during the kind of May, June timeframe. And then a lot of times in July, I'll move them every 2 or 3 days and keep that. And then in the fall and winter, when stuff isn't growing, that's where I'll give them just a new section without back fencing them, and just give them a new section maybe every couple weeks or something like that. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about the equipment that I use anyway and have found to be good. So I've tried a few different rollers. The Gallagher roller is probably one of the more expensive rollers, and it's slightly heavier than some of the other geared rollers. So these are rollers that you turn the handle once and then the reel spins 3 times. But the Gallagher roller is the only one that I buy now. So the wire guide that keeps the wire going onto the spool on the Gallagher is much more rigid and sturdy and foolproof than some of the others that just kind of snap on and they come off and spin around, and it's a pain. The Gallagher is very ruddy. It has the mechanism for the geared roller is also, I've never had it fail. The locking mechanism to keep it from going, feeding wire out, is also very positive. And then it has a locking mechanism to where when you hook it onto a wire, there's that orange locking mechanism that you see on the bottom of the handle there keeps it to where it can't jump off, even if something hits it or jiggles it. So if you want to make sure your cows aren't going to get out that night because the roller jumped off, then the Gallagher does it. One other thing that I'm very confident in my enthusiasm for is the handle right below that. It's called a Zammer handle, Zammr, I think. And I haven't seen it in stores, but I got it from Crete Lumber in Nebraska. And that is a really nice handle. So the wire connects on the left side, and then the right side has a couple hooks, one that's metal and one that's plastic. So you can hook it on a wire without having it electrify the line that you just put out, and then you can come back and hook it again to electrify the line, which is very handy, I think. The 2 pictures of wires there, poly braid versus poly braid versus poly wire, I think. So the poly braid is the one with the blue star. That's what I prefer. I think it lasts a lot longer, and it just doesn't catch on as much stuff. The poly wire, you can see the kind of threads wrapping around each other, and that one, it just doesn't not last nearly as long. So I prefer the poly braid, even though it's more expensive. And then posts. So the post that looks like a pencil there is the best picture that I could get of the post that I buy the most of now. And that's a 3/8 inch 4-foot fiberglass rod that's usually sharpened at the bottom. It's like $1.80 for one of those at Runnings or some of the big farm stores. And that thing is fiberglass, so it's insulated the whole way. The other option is the push-in pigtail post, which is very common. See a lot of folks with that. The things that I don't like about the pigtail post is that they're heavy and they are a bugger to handle. If you have more than 3 of them in your hand, you can't take one out of your hand because those pigtails wrap around each other. It's the definition of entropy, and it's very frustrating. And so I can hold enough of those fiberglass posts in one hand to go almost 1/4 mile. And the pigtail posts are heavy and hard to maneuver. They're easy to push in. They're very positive. The pigtail part on the top, the metal that pigs around and then or curls around with plastic over it. After a couple summers of being out in the sun, that plastic usually cracks and they start snapping through there. And so they're only about a 2-year post, it seems like, and they're pretty expensive. They're about $5 or $6 a piece, and the wire can only have one height. Unless you angle the post as you put it in the ground, the height is the way the height is. The advantage of those is that you can put the wire onto and off of it very fast, almost with no hands in the wire roller, and you can run a long stretch and kind of tension the whole wire through all those pigtail posts. The fiberglass pipe post I got turned on to from a gentleman out in Utah that runs a bunch of cattle out there, and he had on his YouTube those with a knot that you can use. It's you kind of go around the post and then up over and around the other way, and it's a kind of a locking knot that has friction that holds the poly line on there. And so there's no insulators, and you can use those push-in posts and walk a quarter of a mile without going back to your four-wheeler or truck to be able to put the wire on. In order to put those posts into the ground, if it's wet out, I can push them into the ground with my hand. But if it's dry or my ground is hard, then I have that square tubing apparatus that you see on the tailgate of my truck up there. And it's just a piece of metal square tubing that's capped at one end with a piece of leather glove stuck up in there. And I use it just basically like a post pounder. I thought maybe I'd push it in with my feet, is why I put those crossbars on there, but those, I never use those. I just use it like a battering ram and tap that into the ground. And I can push that through probably an inch of frost too, if I want to. If it does get too hard, I can take a drill out and just drill a pilot hole and then punch that in 12 months out of the year. All right, I think that is it for the equipment. The next topic, grass-fed, grass-finished beef production. So as I got more interested in human health and the detriments of omega-6 fatty acids and the benefits of grass-fed beef, I was like, I want to go there. But I'd had some grass-fed beef, and I'd heard other people talk about grass-fed beef that looks like that center picture there. No marbling, gamey flavor. I didn't want that. And so we've been on a quest to make marbling, like you see on the right there, which is one of our grass-fed steaks one year, and make the animals look like that steer on the left, which is one that is just ready to go to the butcher here in the next couple of days. So we wanted marbling. We wanted good taste. And then we also wanted that good omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio, as well as good phytonutrients. From the grazing that we were doing and then feeding them wrapped baleage, we've tested 2 of our animals with the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio and found it to be about 1-to-1, which is right where I've heard everybody, you want that for good health for your meat. We also tested some meat from a major retailer at that same time, the cheapest 85-15 burger I could find, and the omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio was 10-to-1. So a marked difference from grain-fed production beef to the grass-fed beef. In order to get the performance out of the animals, to get those things that I wanted, we are working on our genetics to have a short, wide, moderately framed cow and our bulls. And then management, we try not to shirk the stocker phase or the calf phase. We want those animals gaining at least 1.7 pounds per day in order to be able to put on good marbling later on. So the animals that we just brought in and butchered was about 2.2 pounds per day on average for their lifetime that they gained. It's still not as good as a feedlot where they're up closer to 3 for their lifetime, but that's where we want to go. High protein in the growing and stocker phase on the calves and the young finishers. And then as they go towards finishing, then we need to pull back on the protein if we can and put the foot down on the gas pedal for the energy. And that's the biggest challenge, is to get forage that's high quality and high in energy to be able to replace that energy that you'd get with that high mega-cal diet that's full of starches and omega-6 fatty acid ratios. And then the last thing is variety, trying to get variety into their diet, which I was feeding a lot of that alfalfa before because it was the best thing that I had, but we're trying to increase the variety there, which they're seeing from a lot of the tests that the Bionutrient Food Association is doing now with beef. They are seeing a loose correlation anyway between good omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratios and just the breadth of sward that these animals are eating over their lifetime. Slide. All right. Finishing animals using fermented feedstocks. So I started using those wrapped bales because it was the best thing that I had. And now I'm starting to see a little bit more other folks that are using that idea as well. One of the most knowledgeable people that I found on that was a guy named Ken Hamilton. And I saw a talk that he did for a webinar by the Bionutrient Food Association this summer. He has an organization called Omega Balance Natural Beef in Utah, and they are using wrapped baleage as well with a probiotic, an inoculant that they've come up with that they spray onto the hay when they're baling it, and it helps in the fermentation process, and it helps make more of the nutrients and energy in the cellulose and fiber more available to the cow so that they absorb it more than pass it out their back end. And so he is showing with some of those an increased performance that I think I'm starting to see a little bit of too, even though I'm not using his particular inoculant. We're using some higher quality baleage this year than we were last year, and we bumped up our average daily gain, and we decreased the number of months to finish by at least 2 or 3. So what am I feeding them? The first year I fed that alfalfa baleage, and that was okay. And now I'm feeding the alfalfa winter rye mix, and I think that's better. What we are pushing towards next year is doing more forage mixes. So people refer to it as a cover crop. It's not my cover crop, it's my main crop now, is what I'm pushing towards, like this very diverse mix of warm season grasses and brassicas and a bunch of different families, including corn that's not set in ear yet, sorghum sudan grass, and things like that, to be able to give more variety and energy to these animals as I'm feeding them. Go on to the next slide. So I not only feed them, but I graze them. So we're starting from the calves on the cows. So we're creep feeding our calves. It took me until this year to figure out exactly how to do it, but that top picture there is a small little enclosure that I built in the paddock where my cows and calves are, out of movable cattle panels made out of well pipe and things like that. And I also have one of those cattle panels. I took some of the sucker rod off of it, or didn't have it put on, and I put it on vertically. So it ended up being little stanchions or little holes that the calves can get through, but the cows can't get through. So the calves can get inside this little circle that I made. I put a bale feeder in there, and then I put some of that baleage in there. So what they're eating right there is that winter rye alfalfa mix that they are eating, and so that I can start to push them a little bit faster while they're still on the cow. We try to keep our calves on the cow for about 10 months. My calves were born last April, and they're still on the cow right now. So they're being prep fed that so that I don't have to make my cows as fat as sows in order to give my calves good feed as well, kind of. And so I've started doing the creep feeding there. And then for my finishers, I'm doing what I call intensive rotational feeding. Many people have heard intensive rotational grazing. And so I'm doing that. I'm rotating them, but I'm also bringing out a silage wagon, those red bale feeders that have inserts so you can put silage in there. And I'm giving them high quality baleage or silage in those wagons so they can eat the grass from the field if that's more appealing to them that day. But if it's not and they're at all hungry, they can just go up to the feeder and get their whatever will satiate them and help them continue to gain. So sometimes they graze quite a bit. Sometimes I call it recreational grazing because they're just really not doing much. But cattle love to graze. And so even if their stomach's full, they love to go out there and just move their head around and graze. And then the two pictures of meat, that's, I think, as producers of food and not producers of a commodity, we need to be interested in the quality of our product and how to prepare our product. So I've tried to educate myself and those around me a little bit more on how to prepare steak well and how to prepare roasts well and what seasonings work and temperatures and cooking times and things like that. So that's some tri-tip on the left and then a roast on the right there. Slide. All right. That's 34 minutes. And so we can go over questions or I can talk through. There's a couple points on some of the pictures on this slide that I could talk to as well.
Yeah, go ahead. If you have questions, put them either in the chat or the Q&A section. We did have one question come in back to the fencing, and it said the question was, if you don't attach the poly wire to the round fiberglass post with a bracket, how do you keep the poly wire knot from slipping down the post, or do you have problems with that?
That's that special knot. So I, as I'm going along, I'm pulling the wire along and I push in the post and I do this kind of friction knot around the post at each post. And that allows the wire not to slip on the post. And it also allows me to put it at any height that I want on the post and potentially putting 2 or 3 wires. So sometimes if the calves are young and I really need to keep them out of an area, I can run 1 wire across and make those slip knots and put it, 6 inches off the ground. And then I can run another wire across and put that 6 inches above that. And so there are 2 wires there and I can put it at any height that I want. But it's hard. I obviously don't have one with me. It's a little bit of a tricky knot to understand, but then once you get it, it's pretty simple.
What, back to that question. Sorry, this was my add-on question. How hard is it to undo when you're rolling up a fence?
It's very easy. I mean, you can just go along each post and just whoop, pop the wire off the top and it just unwinds. The only time I haven't just had it unwind is if I had like a freezing rain or really cold. Sometimes those knots will get a little bit tight and you have to kind of work them out a little bit. But that's one of the advantages of having that Zammer handle is that you can de-electrify the line and go along and do that and pull your posts out and then unhook your line and just stand at the end and wind up the line the whole way across unless your handle gets hooked on the ground a little bit.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. It's not a perfect system, but I'm enjoying it.
All right. Next question, on the ratio of the omega-6 to omega-3, what was that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 that you have seen or are shooting for in your beef?
It sounds like anything less than 3 to 1. So 3 omega-6s to 1 omega-3. That's where grass-fed beef generally is. Our ratio was less than 1 to 1. So we had actually slightly more omega-3s than omega-6s. So our ratio was 0.7 and 0.8. The ratio for the Walmart beef was 10 to 1. And we also tested a neighbor who does forage finishing. So he feeds high quality forage, green forage, a lot of baleage and stuff like that. And he also feeds corn silage and some cracked corn and produces really nice meat, highly marbled, delicious. It looks good at the butcher. And his ratio was 1.7 to 1. So that was pretty impressive for including some grain. When we looked not just at the ratio, but at the raw numbers, that was what was really interesting, is that that forage finished, including corn, beef, his omega-6s, just the raw number, was almost as high as the Walmart stuff. But his omega-3s were in some case higher than mine even. So it just proved that basically the animals are a reflection of what they eat when it comes to those essential fatty acids, because animals don't produce those, they just reflect what they've been eating. They reflect the ratio of what food they've been eating. So the more green stuff you have, the more omega-3s you're going to have. The more seed crops, corn, soybeans, peanuts, sunflowers, safflowers, more of those things with that high, like 70-to-1 omega-6 to 3 ratio, that it's going to be reflected in the meat.
Follow-up question with that was, can you tell us where you had those samples done and what that cost is roughly?
Yeah. So that was dumb luck. I met at one of my kids' school events somebody in Sioux Falls that has a company called Omega Quant. Don't call Omega Quant. They're not in the business of doing samples of beef. They do like stuff internationally with some application that's bigger than me as a farmer. But I met him and he obliged me and did those samples for me. But if you are interested in doing it, write down the name. It's called Audacious Lab, and that starts with an E. And the CEO of that is a guy named Eric Smith, I think. And that was another webinar that I saw with the Bionutrient Food Association this summer. They have partnered with the Bionutrient Food Association, this lab called Audacious. They basically created the lab in order to do the testing of beef for the Bionutrient Food Association. So they did a deep dive with a whole bunch of producers this year to get a lot of benchmarks and information so that they could try to nail down what exactly you should look for if you're looking for healthy beef. And their end goal is to produce a handheld device that at the point of sale, consumers can flash a light and get a readout of how healthy that beef is. And so anyway, great guy. For the price for him, if you need software to look at the results. They give you amazing results of not only the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, all the fatty acids, saturated fat, all the vitamins, B vitamins, phytonutrients, a huge list of stuff, and how your stuff compares to different benchmarks. So you can use that for also your own management as well as advertising. And getting, I think, the software plus 6 samples was like $1,800. And then each additional sample after that is like $150 or something like that for a year. So it's pricey, but it's not, what I'd seen before that was like $1,500 a sample, which is just not doable. So anyway, that's Audacious Lab is who I'm working with now.
That's EDACIOUS.
I think so.
Okay. I think I've got the link in the chat there for.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yep.
Yep. Awesome. Next question. Talk about your experimentation with meat preparation. Do you use a smoker or a grill? How are you doing that?
Right. I'm not a big smoker. I don't have a lot of experience in that yet. So I haven't caught on to that. So the first thing that I advise people is know how much salt to put in it. Most people, including me, historically, have not added enough salt. You should salt your meat 1 to 1.5% of the weight in meat in salt. And so I try to do that on my steaks, my roasts, my burger. That's kind of my benchmark there. And then what that ends up being usually is about a teaspoon of salt per pound. And it looks big at first, but it helps. So I do that. My next kind of just go-to recipe is I do salt, that teaspoon per pound, and then about a half a teaspoon per pound of ground black pepper, and then about a quarter teaspoon per pound of onion powder, as well as another quarter teaspoon per pound of garlic powder. And then I'll either go for a little bit spicy or a little bit savory. If I'm going for the spicy, I'll put in about 1/8 of a teaspoon per pound of cayenne pepper. Or if I'm going for the savory, then I'll put in like a quarter of a teaspoon per pound of thyme or sage. or basil or something like that. Uh, and on roasts, I like to do a dry rub of everything and then put it in a slow cooker or in the oven at like 250 degrees. Slow cooker on low with some onions below it. Fill up the container about halfway up the meat with water and then just let it go low and slow and test it. I don't test it with a thermometer. I test it with a fork. And if it's not tender, just put it in longer because the collagen that is in those pot roast, the chuck roast, and things like that, those molecules will unwind into gelatin if they have heat in the temperature band of like the high 100s, plus moisture, plus time. So heat, moisture, and time is what they need. And they'll eventually turn into gelatin, which is just, it just falls apart, falls off the bone, falls apart with a fork, and is delicious. So that's my roasts. For my steaks, I do that dry rub. Try to do that ahead of time, a few hours ahead of time so that the seasoning can soak into the meat. I like to get my grill at least 450 degrees and throw it on the grill. I have the steaks cut extra thick. They're like 1.25 inches is what I tell the butcher. I put the steaks on one side for about 3.5 to 4 minutes until I get a good charring a little bit on that side. Flip it over, and then you got to have an instant digital meat thermometer and start checking that then. And I pull it off somewhere between 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit internal temperature. Let it rest for about 4 or 5 minutes and then cut into it. Is my steak kind of go-to. The fattier the cut of steak, the higher you can let the temperature go. The leaner the cut of steak, the more I lean towards the 120. So I'm either 120 to 130, but leaning which direction there depends upon whether it's a ribeye or if it's a sirloin. The ribeye being fattier, the sirloin being leaner. And then hamburger, I have basically the same spice recipe there. One of the things that I concentrate on the hamburger is not packing it together. So as I take these tubes, the 1 pound tubes that we get, as I put them into the bowl, I don't put them in there and just put the seasoning over top. I kind of try to break them in there or crumble them into the bowl, put the seasoning on, and instead of like squishing it through my fingers, I try to fluff it up like I'm fluffing up a salad. And so that I get just kind of these big chunks or aggregates of hamburger. And then when I patty the burgers, I take them and try to work them as little as possible to get them into that patty to make as much pore space and airspace in the middle of the hamburger as possible. And again, I have my grill on as hot as I can get it to try to get that Maillard reaction, the browning on the outside before the inside gets too overdone so that they're juicy, but not overdone. So that's kind of my meal
Cooking
preparation.
Karl at lunchtime is makes you hungry.
Yeah.
Back to the cattle. What age are you shooting for on your finishers for slaughter?
The first year it was averaged about probably 24 to 25, 26 months on average. I think the oldest was 27 months. This year we slaughtered the first one here that was well finished at about 20 months. So my goal is to get close to that 18-month point because I would love to. I talked a lot about feeding the fermented forage. I think the best feed that's the cheapest is grazing that multi-species cover crop during the summer. So I would love to calf in April and then be able to have the cows and calves out on nice green stuff that's cheap and easy and good during that summer. Only have to winter them one full winter and then be able to push them hard that next summer and bring them into slaughter by that late fall, by like November, December of that next year. So that I don't have to go through November, December are fine, but like January and February tend to be really cold. March and April are wet and muddy. Nothing's growing yet. Those March and April are just kind of buggers of months for cows, I think.
What about that forage that you're talking about, the warm season cover, what people would call a cover crop or grazing corn?
Yeah.
Are you planting that into your alfalfa then, or seeding?
I'm trying. I'm trying a few different things. So this last year, I kind of tried to follow a little bit of Rick Clark, the no-till organic guy. So I spiked in winter rye really heavy into alfalfa the fall before. I let the alfalfa and winter rye grow fully, let the winter rye head out, start to pollinate or get into anthesis. And then I took my roller crimper out there and I roller crimped the winter rye and the alfalfa. I probably should have left it a little bit longer to get the alfalfa into more of a full flower because I was desiring to set it back by roller crimping it when it was in that full reproductive stage. Prior to that, I went out there with the drill and drilled in. It was kind of a test plot, so I drilled in soybeans in one area, grazing corn in one area, and sorghum Sudan grass in the next area. And I think the picture that you had on the first slide showed me grazing through that cover crop experiment. And the corn and sorghum Sudan grass and soybeans, they germinated and started to come up. And then the alfalfa really took off to where for a while, you couldn't even tell that it was anything other than an alfalfa field. But finally, there you go. Finally, the sorghum Sudan grass and the corn got above the alfalfa. And so they weren't good enough to where I was going to even entertain like harvesting them for grain corn or grain soybeans. But it was good enough to where I strip grazed my finishers through that. And that's what it looked like there. That I think they had good performance on. I had a good mixture of obviously a lot of protein in the alfalfa and some good energy. What I noticed is that given the choice, when they went into the new paddock, they had access to a sorghum Sudan grass area, a corn area, and a soybean area. After the first couple days, they figured out what was what. They would always go to the corn first, which told me that corn had a higher sugar content, was more palatable than even the sorghum Sudan grass. And so anyway, that was just kind of something to note. I'm trying to make some sort of a mix that gives me as much energy as I can get.
Awesome. Next question. What are you figuring for acres of grass grazing for your animals per animal or per animal unit? Kind of what are you shooting for?
Yeah, per cow calf pair. It's, some people say that like I'm running cow calf pair per acre or something like that, but they're doing it from May to September and then they're off of it. I'm trying to do it almost year round. And so if you're talking about like my perennial grasses that I'm running, I'm still not that good. I'm like probably 2.5 acres per cow calf pair with my rotational grazing. With those cows, I try to keep them in good condition and try to keep pushing the calves along. But that's my perennial pasture that I run during the summer, basically. And then I'm grazing off the row crop residue. Frozen off alfalfa is what I have right now. I don't have any corn stalks or anything like that, but that residue. And I got by with my cow calf herd. I had about 180 acres of frozen off alfalfa, and I was giving them that little by little. And they were on that predominantly from about October through about the first of the year this year. I would give them a bale every once in a while to kind of even things out, but they still are grazing it quite a bit, but it's starting to get down there to where probably the slight majority of their inputs are coming from the bales that I feed them now, not from what they're getting out in the field.
Awesome. Well, we do have a few more minutes left and a few more questions, but if you have a question, we'll try to hit them rapid fire here in the last 5 or 6 minutes. Next question that we had is, what does your winter feeding program look like? And you've talked a little bit about it just now, but now that we're past January,
a lot depends on snow. Right now, they're out grazing, and then I'm feeding to my finishers. I'm feeding baleage. I also have a dry grass bale in a bale feeder available for them if they choose to eat that. They don't eat much of that, but they're eating frozen off alfalfa recreationally and then eating the alfalfa winter ride baleage. For my cow calf stuff, I'm giving them some alfalfa baleage that I had left over from last year, and then some dry grass hay in feeders as well.
Great. What was the brand of the automated water that you were using? The three.
I think it was ThermaSync, I think was the brand. It's made like up in North Dakota, which is where you want to get stuff for Canada if you're looking for a frost-free water.
Frost-free waters. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Could you talk, Karl, could you talk more about the cattle genetic selection as you're looking to improve your meat quality, your marbling,
Mhm.
and beyond that?
Yeah.
How are you doing that?
Yeah. Physically, the phenotype is you want short, wide cattle that will be easy fleshing. And so I'm kind of breeding for short cattle. I did get into like linear measurements and measuring all these proportions of the animal and things like that. But I found so much wrong with every one of my animals that I just wasn't happy with any of them, because you got this ideal that you're shooting for. And so what I ended up doing is now I'm pretty much letting fertility select for what I keep. So I expose bulls for a 45 to 60-day period, pull the bulls, and then whoever didn't get bred goes into the finishing lot or the cull lot. And trying to let that sort for my fertility, both for the first calf heifers, second calf heifers, and then for the herd overall. Also, it's nice, doing the direct marketing and looking at each one of the animals and having the butcher shop across the road from my house. I get feedback on each of the animals. And so I have every once in a while one that looks just the same as the others. They say, that one, had a lot leaner. Maybe it smelled gamey or something like that. So it's nice to get the feedback from the butcher on that. And then I take notes on, keep notes on a spreadsheet of every animal that's butchered, the butcher feedback, the customer feedback, what they say about it, and things like that.
What that brings up a good question as we probably have a variety of people listening in, watching in today that maybe are, just focused on a grass-fed cow-calf herd or interested in, adding more grass to their thing, to their operation, or possibly they're looking at, bringing in some cattle to an organic rotation. Talk to me about your marketing. Are you direct marketing everything, most everything, some things, or how are you marketing what you're raising?
I would say probably 70% of it I'm direct marketing now, unless I get to the end of the year and have a bunch that's not sold, and I just throw the rest of that to the sale barn. So I have a website, so I pay Google a little bit to advertise if somebody searches for grass-fed beef in the local area, and then most of the rest of my marketing is I hand out business cards. I talk to people in the peer groups that we're at, like we're in our kids are in dance class in Sioux Falls. I'm lucky to have a town of 220,000 people just 5 minutes away. And so most of the demand comes from there, and it's peer to peer, word of mouth, and talking about it is primarily. I started to write a newsletter that I send to those folks on email just to remind them. I texted a bunch of them with that webinar that I had done before. That's an easy way for them to send somebody that they know some information without having to regurgitate everything that I said, because most people that are just buying beef don't understand a lot of it and can't kind of regurgitate that to somebody else that might be interested, their friends or family. So it's a lot of word of mouth, kind of.
Great. Well, awesome. Well, unless there's any other questions that pop up, I do want to thank you again, Karl, for taking some time on a mildly cool. I don't know. It's not a super cold day, right? It could be
Yeah.
worse. Taking some time with us at lunch to talk about what you're doing, your grass-fed grazing, your annuals, your perennials, and using all of those mixed together with your forage feeding, I think is a pretty cool thing. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Ethan.
And again, I just want to remind everybody that we have webinars coming up, so we'll be back right away next Wednesday at the same time for weed management with Scott Shriver on his farm, and then you can kind of look and see what we have coming up. But yeah, a lot of exciting webinars, and we hope that you will join us in the future. I do want to reiterate that there is a recording of this, so if you want to go back and find any of those nuggets, we'll be sending out an email when it gets posted to our YouTube page. So again, Karl, thank you so much for the cooking advice, the grazing advice, and all along. I'm going to go have some lunch now. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks.